Hello and welcome to Conversations about Language Teaching. I'm Dr. Diane Neubauer, she, her.
And I'm Dr. Reed Riggs, he, him.
And today I'm going to lead this episode. We're going to pick up on some more questions from listeners or viewers of the podcast. And this one is actually, it's been there in the background for a while, and it's on pronunciation development and accuracy of pronunciation, or native-like pronunciation, we might say. So I'm going to jump over to a little bit of the actual question because I really liked it. So this was somebody asking in a group on WeChat, Chinese language learner in this case. As learners, what were the most common tone mistakes you made when you first began? What helped you detect and finally overcome them? Trying to figure out some common patterns so that I can point them out. Has anyone done this work? Feedback, welcome. I noticed that most English speakers subconsciously begin a sentence or phrase with second tone. In other words, like a kind of a sound. So if the first word is 我, which should dip down low, it sounds too high in pitch. So not to get too much into the weeds of Chinese pronunciation, but a specific case example was given of a common pattern sounding like somebody English speaking was bringing in their English inflection into the way that first word in a sentence would normally sound. And I actually replied right there and said, I don't think of it quite the same way, that listening closely and really feeling the impact of the sounds before you're trying to create it out of your own mouth has been extremely helpful, and a minimal little bit of repair on those has, especially when my students have lost the ability to communicate clearly. That's where I focused on pronunciation more and done some contrast exercises just very briefly for a few seconds, right in the time of need. And then, basically getting a really strong ear for it has been kind of where I went with that. And the person said, thanks so much. Actually, I'd love for you to talk about this on the podcast. I'm like, oh, wow. Okay, let's go for it. So I just gave my nutshell answer. But what I hear as pushback, two, one from native Chinese speakers, particularly, who are really concerned about any kind of deviation from a very standard pronunciation. They're concerned that if they don't get that student right from the beginning, that they're never going to have it happen, because they think fossilization is a really big problem. I think they're missing some of the context in which they're doing pronunciation work. I think they're asking students without that developed implicit, oh, that sounds right to me, kind of a feel, because they lacked constant and prevalent exposure to the language used communicatively around them. With a little bit of focus on the form from time to time when it's necessary to clarify the meaning. Because they don't have that experience, they can't imagine that the learner is going to develop a good ear for pronunciation, because they've never seen it happen in their classroom, where they're really focused on explicit training. Do it this way, produce it now, and produce it accurately. Oh, let me correct you until you produce it accurately. Now you did it accurately. Oh, now you did it wrong again. Let me correct you again. And so this constant focus on production, explicit training, accuracy of form, and not on the development of really a more natural like acquisition process, I think is setting them up for not being able to do what I see my students do. And so, and I've seen this also from independent language learners who are like, yeah, I tried the input approach. And like, well, what did you mean by that? I don't know what they meant by it, but I know what I mean when I'm talking about a very input-based but interactive and communicative classroom, where there is a little bit, I do a little bit of explicit work on pronunciation, again, where it's hindering communication. And I start it with the ear training of, do you recognize the difference in these two sounds? And I wait to see where students have problems, or they ask questions, or those kinds of things. So it's not that I do absolutely nothing of a focus on pronunciation, but it's so embedded into this nice, warm, comprehensible,
Yeah.
communicative,
Yeah.
mostly. It's not
Yeah.
perfect.
Hmm.
But
You're saying it's occasioned, like when you do some sort of drilling training, kind of ear training kind of thing, that's very focused on forms. It's occasioned by the ongoing communication, the whatever bigger meaning you're
yes,
talking about. And then you say, oh, this is causing a communication problem. Let's pause our topic here and do a
right.
little ear training. Can you hear this or hear that? Let's do it a bunch so you can kind of build an ear for
Hmm.
it in this moment.
Yeah. And
Yeah,
even talk to them about here's the way I'm making that sound. Oh, this one's back at the top of my mouth, or
sure.
like literally doing that. You
Right.
want to try it
Right.
out? Here's a way we can go from like there's a C sound in Mandarin that is tricky for English speakers to produce at the beginning of a syllable at first, but we
Yeah.
have the sound in English. It's at the end of the word cats.
Hmm.
Or at least it's really
Hmm.
close to the
Sure.
Mandarin sound.
Yeah.
And so I just have them do cats,
Yeah. Right.
and then
Yep.
start it,
Yeah.
Oh, so now that you've identified it, it doesn't mean that they're going to do it perfectly though. So
Yeah.
again, it's not that they have to have it accurate for the rest of time or they'll never get it.
Right.
It's much more of a sprinkled in
Yeah.
thing where again, oh, if there's another breakdown in communication because of that, I might pause and point it out. But over time, I see students develop better pronunciation in the same way that I see students over time develop more complex sentence production and accurate sentence structures. And,
Sure. Sure.
because languages develop, they are not drilled into the head and then
Yeah.
produced verbatim,
Right.
like a brick.
Yeah.
It's a growing plant in there that they've got.
Yeah.
So it's working.
These mental systems take time to develop. And I want to, as you were introducing this topic and reading off the exchange you had, um, I was kind of running through all these, I've been learning Chinese since 2001, so it's a long time for me. And I lived in China for
Well,
7 years, and I had
I have
classmates
since
from countries.
1992.
There you
So
go.
there you go.
Okay. All right. So we both
So,
have many decades of lots of experiences. And so my mind is just flooding with all these personal experiences. But
yeah.
then I started to think, can I think of any research I could tie this to? And I did think of one. It was a
Well, I've got
classmate
some
of
too.
mine who, and it's specifically about tones. This is perfect. Um, so she won a graduate student award at a graduate student conference that we had at our school at University of Hawaii around 2016 or 2017. I graduated in 2018, and so it was around that time. And what she had done, I participated, and my wife non-participated in her lab ear. It was like a listening experiment, and we would
Hmm.
just listen to these isolated syllables. We just listen to be like wa, and then you hit a key left or right, and you
Which
move on.
tone?
Yep.
Or yeah.
Are they different or same? I think that was kind of how it was.
Okay.
And so she was using software that would check the speed of our response. And so she had all these little
Huh.
micrometrics of how many milliseconds it took for us to respond. And she had native speakers do it too. And so what she found, the overall description, the overall summary of what she found was that native speakers of Chinese, or I think also more higher proficiency speakers of Chinese, are more categorical in their tones. And so we were like, oh, this, I automatically perceived that, oh, this is different from that. Like this is a first tone category, this is a second tone category.
Because there's
Whereas
some variation of
there's
production within those,
absolutely,
right?
you and I are
But
speaking
the
English right
boxes.
now, and you're like, if I took a clip from our recording of you saying the word the, and then another clip from our recording of me saying the word the, and another clip from our recording of you saying the word the at a different time, and you try to look at the sound waves, the exact
Yeah.
imagery of the sound waves, they will never be identical. No
Yeah.
two are ever identical. But our brains work categorically where we go, oh, well, this is basically the same thing. Oh, this
It
is,
categorizes it.
yeah, we
Oh, that's so
categorize.
fascinating.
Yeah. And
And
so
that micro variation is what I think we forget as language teachers so
yeah,
often.
that's right.
It's not absolutely exactly one thing,
No.
even when there's a standard version of the language that you're expected to pronounce in a certain way. There, the way that people actually use language is a
Yeah.
little bit messier, and
Yep.
it's little like I'm
Yeah.
getting the picture of the
Sure.
Romanesco cauliflower and the
Yeah.
little micro,
Yeah. You zoom in and you see another
yeah,
level.
there's more details.
There's a lot of detail, and that's why I share this metaphor. I wrote this up as a little article a couple years ago about I use water metaphors with my students a lot because I find it helpful to say like language usage isn't this one thing you've memorized. It's like learning how to watch ocean waves come and you catch the waves. They're never identical. You can't think of it as one thing, and you just have to get kind of used to these bigger overall I guess patterns. I'll call them patterns in language usage. But so with the lower proficiency speakers in her study were more acoustical, where it was like, oh, I think of a second. What I hear is this pitch rising upward. This is rising
Mm,
upward, and I can hear this kind of falling downward. Whereas the more proficient and native speakers wouldn't really pay attention to those details. It was just this is this category, this is this category. And
yeah,
so that's cognitive development. That's not something that you can train you can't just explicitly tell someone, oh, these categories exist in the minds of competent speakers. Now you
right.
have those categories. They
Yeah,
develop. Those categories have to develop, and they develop through lots and lots and lots of experience with the language.
yeah,
I say experience to include input and production because I think people's production does impact their mental system. I think that if you're
yeah. So,
constantly you can also ask people generally just in life, like, does this sound right or does this sound right? And they'll go, some people will say, oh, I always hear it this way. And sometimes people
mhm,
say, oh, I always say it this way. And so it just all adds up to your overall experience. That's my
right.
my view on it. Um, yeah, I had a classmate graduate school, master's degree in Sichuan University, and he was from um, Canada, from Quebec. He had a very French Canadian way of speaking English. And if he's listening now, hey, thanks for listening. So um, his Chinese sounded exactly the same. It was like all
Mhm.
just French Canadian intonation. And he would say, I never learned the tones, and my vocabulary is so big now that I don't want to go back. Like, how would I go back and learn every single little tone? I'm not going to check the dictionary on every single little tone.
Mhm.
He communicated just fine. People understood him just fine because they use
See, that's good.
context, the context of the topic, the context of the whatever he's saying. And so whenever my students ask me like, hey, can't people just understand me if I don't have tones at all? Like my high school students are just trying to get the grade, get the class done. Like they're not really thinking in terms of um, being a competent, intelligent looking speaker out with other speakers. Like they just want to get the coursework done. And when I say I need you to pay attention to these tones, we're going to have a little formative assessment. Some of my students are into it, most of them are not. And that question comes up like, do I need tones to communicate? And I do share the story of my French Canadian friend who
Yeah.
apparently didn't need tones to communicate. But I do point out
Well,
if you slow down, if you want to be clear, you make yourself less understood and less clear when you say
yes.
something slowly with the wrong tones, because now you're carefully saying other things compared
Yeah.
to what you wanted to say. The language forms
Right.
are not the same language forms.
Yeah.
So yeah,
And what it reminded me of a little bit was that issue of the identity of the learner and their other languages and their other accents. And like you don't have to not have an accent. It's okay for you to still be obviously a second language learner. And the monolingual speaker of that language is not your model. Like you want to be able to communicate with some of those folks, but
yeah,
you also want to communicate with other second language speakers of the language you're learning. And it's okay for people to hear in your voice that you are that second language speaker. And
mhm,
I'm telling myself this because for many years I really wanted perfect standard Mandarin pronunciation. And I will still miss things, but I screw up my English too to some degree. It's part of being a human being,
yeah,
you know?
yeah,
It's the way that we use language is something that is human, and it's not something that uh, to sterilize so that everybody sounded exactly the same, I think would be a sad thing. It's bringing in some of your past experience
Yeah.
when you have an accent. So
Yeah.
yes, I want to have people able to understand the people I'm teaching Chinese or my own Chinese or other languages I speak, like French that comes out combined with Mandarin most of the time when I try.
Yeah.
Um, I want to be able to communicate and to understand what other people are telling me in the languages I've
Yeah.
known a little, but it's not about sterilizing it, freeing it from
Sure.
any
Yeah.
aspect of who I am or my background.
Yeah.
And that has been a long, long process for me to get there. And I think it's frequently a part of Mandarin Chinese learning because we have such an emphasis on standardized language in
Yeah. Yeah.
China
In China. Yep.
that the Chinese people will rate each other and tease each other and mock even a
Yeah.
little bit.
Mhm.
And then compared to my Chinese, and then it's very uncomfortable socially to be in that kind of setting. I think we
Yeah.
need to let people have an accent. And sometimes, accents are very pleasing to hear at times.
Yeah.
There are statuses, unfortunately, to different accents, but some of them are really appealing to the speakers of that language. So
Mhm. Mhm.
like sterilizing yourself of it might be a real loss.
Yeah. Um, yeah, I can imitate an old man in Beijing, but I don't want to pretend that I'm an old man in Beijing. Like
Right.
they're socio like every person has their kind of social group and social identity that they project themselves to be a member of through how they talk. And there's no, even a standard newscaster, I'm not going to socialize with Chinese friends and I'm not going to talk like a Chinese newscaster to socialize with them because that's weird.
Yeah, it's
That
weird.
would make an awkward situation. And when I've seen students be perfect in a classroom, getting every tone right, I think, well, but what are you communicating? Like in English right now, like there's always prosody, and the prosody is your rhythm, your intonation. There's intonation as well in Chinese, which we don't talk about.
Yes.
And there is
Yes, but it's
intonation.
huge in that comprehension
It's
factor
yes, it's
that you were
huge, and
just talking about.
and for you to be
Mhm.
understood. So um, and if you just put on a Chinese drama or put on a Chinese TV show or watch a Chinese YouTuber or TikToker or whatever, you'll see it right away. Like you can't communicate without prosody because then what are you communicating? And so I'm doing it right now. I'm sounding emphatic. I'm sounding super interested. If I take all that away, I am talking about Chinese language and about prosody. You might make other assumptions and you're like, is he angry? Like you'll always make
Yeah,
there is always some kind of prosody going on, but now it's
right.
not the prosody I intended to communicate, or prosody I tended to use to communicate some sort of feeling or attitude about something. And that's layered on top of the tones. And so to teach it, again, I'm going to come back to these ocean metaphors. Like you can mathematically describe the exact surface of the ocean, surf of the water. There's little waves, there's little micro ripples, and then there's like big waves forming. It just gets so complex that that's not the way we should approach it. If you just participate in it, then you build up a sense. It's mostly implicit, and that's, I would say, the only way to gain something from that level of complexity.
Mhm.
I got a lot my
Yeah.
last year in China where I was sort of tired. I wasn't talking as much. And when I'd be around Chinese friends, I would just listen because I was just genuinely tired. And so they would open up. They saw me as like a good listener. And so they would just start complaining about work or complaining about family. And I would say to this day, a lot of my ability to speak Chinese in an angry way or in a frustrated way was from those interactions where I got to observe people expressing frustration and expressing anger. And I got
Mhm.
to hear and see how Chinese people talk in those situations. But a textbook doesn't present that. A classroom doesn't usually present that. Even the authentic videos that teachers try to find are typically, street interviews, documentaries. People don't express those kinds of emotions. They could. It's just as teachers, we don't often think that way. So I want things to be clear so my students just understand words and grammar, so they
Mhm.
can hear clear tones. Okay, but there's still like so much else
There's
that would
more.
go on, and it doesn't have to happen in a classroom. It could be in the student's own life, after the classroom time they spend. But to think that our goals are just perfect tones, perfect words, perfect grammar. That's I don't know, that's sheet ice. That's not the ocean surface. That's just not the same
Yeah,
thing. Yeah.
right, right. I have a couple of short thoughts. One was like to the actual question of the person, like, where are your patterns of problems? And this will be a Mandarin example for myself. I have learned recently by making errors in tone judgments. Like I was writing in pinyin and giving some students in my online Chinese class a word that seemed to be a new vocabulary item as we were talking during class. And I selected, now did I called it tone 2, but it was tone 3, actually. I think there's multiple reasons why I might have chosen that, but to my ear, it really seemed right to call that tone 2. I have seen native speaking friends do the same thing where they're like, wait a minute, what tone is that?
Mm,
You know,
mm,
and
mm.
and I'm on the spot in the midst of class. I'm not really analyzing it. I'm just like, okay, I need to put a tone mark on here. So that sounded right to me, that I was confident enough to write it. And some of my students are extremely diligent and went back and checked and said, like, yeah, that should be a 3. Like, oh, I'm sorry, And I finally I responded like, I'm a non-native speaker of the language. I'm really happy with the level of communicative ability that I have and that people can understand me well, but you might catch me doing things that are not native like on occasion. I'm okay with that.
Yep.
Kind of like
Yep. Yeah.
you might experience like not perfect,
Yeah.
because again, are we sterilizing our language? Because again, native
Mm.
speakers, I've paid attention sometimes, just listen to like, let me hear my friends here at church, listen to them speaking Chinese, and some of them will use the wrong tone for a
Yep.
syllable.
Yep.
And
Yep.
and everybody understood them and nobody pointed it out because the
Yeah.
communication was not hindered.
Sure.
And I think it might have even been a regional dialect influence maybe that was doing that. And it's part of who they are. And communication was the goal. And let's
Yep.
focus on that first.
It's probably more
Um,
systematic than an error, and it's only an error in comparison to a dictionary, what a dictionary
yeah.
says. But some
Yes.
things like fa jiao and fa xiao to ferment,
Uh-huh.
the dictionary says it's fa jiao, and
Really?
I heard fa jiao and fa xiao from people because the little
Yeah,
sound
Xiao, I
component
thought.
in the character is a xiao shun to
Yeah.
xiao. It's like filial piety xiao.
Yeah.
And so that should indicate the sound xiao, except the Chinese characters are 2,000 years old with 2,000 years of
Right.
sound changes.
Right.
And yeah, I would often correct people and say like, oh, that's jiao. Look at my dictionary. I would show it in the dictionary. I'd show it on my phone.
Yeah.
And they're like, okay, but we say xiao. Like it's just,
Yeah, but I'm not going to say that because that
right.
sounds weird, right?
Yeah,
Yeah.
I don't say it that way. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Right.
So
Right.
you were saying,
Yeah. The other thing I wanted to mention that study that you found out about is very interesting. There is a book that I think I've mentioned on a previous podcast episode, but I'll bring it up again because half of the chapters are by different authors, a variety of authors with different theoretical perspectives, some of which talk about complexity theory. But the book is called Input Matters in SLA. SLA stands for Second Language Acquisition. That it's edited by Thorsten Pisk and Martha Young Schulten. It's a late 2008 book. But as they say in their little product description, a rare feature of the book is that it includes extensive coverage by experts, including these two people, of the acquisition of the sound system of a second language, where input seems to matter most.
mhm,
Thank you very
mhm,
much.
mhm.
But I'll link to that. I believe that book being as old as it is, you're going to be able to find a lot of those chapters online, and
Yeah.
I will try to link to those.
It's a good age because if it was from the 70s or 80s, then there would be a lot more research done after that that's probably relevant. But if it
Right.
was after 2008, then it might still be behind some kind of paywall. So
Right.
it's a nice it's a nice year to
Yeah.
be it's a fine wine. Um,
Right.
so I think that what this is all pointing to is that as I tell my students this all the time that like language learning is largely based on your exposure. The majority, and that kind of covers all the bases. Yes, researchers are looking at other things too. Yes, your motivation is part of it. Yes, there's other things going on, but it's necessary that it's in your environment and that you're being exposed to it. There's another layer of what's going on is that sometimes students aren't perceiving. They've developed filters in their perception
Yes.
that lead to them not perceiving or sort of blocking out what's being presented to them in their input. And
Hmm.
that could take a little kind of intervention. And it's not
Yeah.
something that you just fix in that moment. Like you don't do a little training and now it's fixed. You're I think of it as you're trying to address that filter so that the next exposure that might be years of exposure can have an impact on their developing system. But you're not,
Right.
if you check that developing system after your quick little training, you still shouldn't expect any big impact because they still haven't had the many, many, many exposures in many, many
Yeah.
relevant contexts that will help them tie it all together. It's just that
Yeah.
it's an attempt to try to address that little filter problem. Yeah.
Yeah. Absolutely. And that reminds me of another thing that during my graduate school years, I was assigned a text on pronunciation instruction. That was a meta-analysis, I want to say. Is that what they called it? But I'll link to that too, because I can't remember the authors. I feel like Luke Plonsky was one of them. But it was on assessing a whole lot of studies about different kinds of ways to do work in pronunciation and the results for students. And one of the things that they were finding was that short-term work on pronunciation had short-term results pretty reliably. But in the context of use of the language in communication, it didn't hold as well. Well, that totally makes sense given everything else we just said.
Yeah.
If it's about developing mainly an implicit system over time with, those little micro moments of that
Yeah,
focus
and also the
don't
implicit system,
translate
an implicit
perfect.
system that is very sensitive to context. So it's like you're not just learning pronunciation, you're learning the contexts in which those pronunciations
Yes,
are relevant.
right.
And so that takes a lot of time to observe all those
Yeah.
different contexts. And if you're not even teaching it in a context, if it's just a little drill,
Yes,
that doesn't transfer to
right.
the context because the contexts weren't part of the drill.
Exactly. And
This
I think a
communicative
lot of
social
these
context.
studies,
Right.
yeah, these studies are often very isolated sound work.
Right. Yeah.
So-
Well, should we move on to another question? Are we
Oh,
satisfied?
yeah.
That's right. It's a Q
I
and A
guess
episode. This almost
yeah, I
turned into
forgot.
just a pronunciation episode. Um,
Yeah, should we stop it here? Because I feel
feel
happy
good?
about that one. Yeah.
Okay. So this is the Q&A episode, and we got to one question.
And and
Pretty
and
good.
we'll call it the pronunciation
All right, that's fine.
development
Yeah, we could
something.
do
Yeah.
that. That makes more sense. Um, great. Yeah, we could stop it here. That sounds very good.
All right.
A bigger takeaway on pronunciation then would be uh, yes, students can walk down a path of never ever caring about Chinese tones. Maybe if you're a teacher of Spanish or French, they'll just develop pronunciations that will bother you forever as a teacher. Um, I don't know that that's always in our control, and I don't know that that even matters if it's something that isn't hurting them. Like it's not harming their communication, it's not harming their social relationships.
Yeah.
They're not choosing to fix anything about it. Um, and also, there's one more thing I would say is that I seem to have a better impact on my students' pronunciation, similar to their tone, their stroke order. That these are little micro things to fix. I find that I have a bigger impact later as opposed to at the beginning.
Hmm.
And so
Yes.
it's easier. Like I had a lisp up until sixth grade, and went to my middle school's speech therapist, and he just said, "Oh, let me say these words for me." And my tongue was sticking up, and he said, "Oh, can you just pull your tongue back? Can you kind of feel the tip of your tongue when you do that?" And I said, "Sure." And then I did it. This is just my native English. Um, and then I was a little conscious of it for a little while. It felt weird for the rest of the day, I remember.
Hmm.
And then I was surprised a few days later that it stuck. I was still doing it. My tongue was in this fixed place. And I never stuck my tongue out again out of my
Yeah.
teeth. And so I think of second language learners as similar and it matches my experience in the classroom that if I catch them later, they've been learning the language for a long time. And then I say, oh, here's this little difference. They'll show a reaction in the moment. They'll show that uptake where they're like, oh, what? Oh, I always did it this way. They notice something
Mhm.
about it because they have
We're
prior
ready.
experience and they can tie it to their prior experience. They can compare it with their prior experience. They can compare it with mental representation that they currently have. which
Hmm.
the beginners have none of that. They don't have mental
Right.
representation of it. They don't have experience with it. They have nothing to compare it to. They have no prior knowledge of it. Everything is just fresh and new. And so
Yeah.
there's not really any connections being made at the beginning.
Right. I thought of a metaphor there. It's like the beginner is, they need to bake the cake. You're asking them to ice something that isn't there yet.
Right. Yeah,
And so
right.
if you got kind of a cake, oh, the icing, there's the
Yeah,
refinement of some little detail of something.
sure.
They have the mental space and capacity to recognize it and to do something with it. And with kind of the light balance about it, the developmental readiness approach to focus on form.
Yeah.
It's got, I guess that's a Michael Long thing too.
Yeah,
Others as well.
you're trying to write happy birthday on the raw batter.
Yes,
It's just going to get
right.
mixed in
Wait
and
till that
lost.
cake is
Yeah,
baked.
it's just going to get
Yeah.
lost. All right.
And maybe along these lines, one other strategy that I do think some might be helpful with prosody and
Mm.
language and context, and it's called shadow reading.
Oh yeah. Hmm.
And you know what I'm talking about. So
Yeah.
you listen to a more proficient speaker or a recording of a text, and you're looking at the text at the time that you hear it, and then you're saying along with that
Yeah.
text
Yeah.
to match the inflection, the tone, the emphasis, just as much as you possibly can.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I sometimes do it just for fun.
Right. I have
So
a story about that. I was Richard Schmidt came up. He said he came up with it. I believe him. He passed away a few years ago. But he was at a poster presentation, a graduate student poster presentation, and I saw one graduate student poster that said effects of shadowing.
mm,
And I said out loud, "What is shadowing?" And he was standing next to me, so he walked up and he goes, "What is shadowing? Start talking." And I was like, "Oh, about what?" And he goes, "Oh, about what?" And I said, "Oh, okay, I'll just keep talking." He goes, "Oh, okay, I'll just keep talking." And he was just mimicking, trying to catch up in real time while I was talking. But he was famous for the noticing hypothesis as an addition to the many core hypotheses of second language acquisition research.
yeah, what a cool
And
encounter.
it was a pretty cool encounter. Yeah, yeah. I was like, "Oh, good. We're all dorks here. Like we're all real like fanatical nerds who will just let loose and
Yeah.
just show our nerdy
If
fandom
you made
for
it to this
second
part of
language
this
learning.
podcast, you are
Yeah,
too.
that's right. Yeah, welcome to the
Yeah,
fandom.
yeah.
So yeah, shadowing. And the purpose of shadowing is to increase your conscious noticing of the
Mhm.
prosody of the pronunciation. That's
Yeah.
the actual acoustics that are being in that moment. Coming back to that filter idea, that so that you don't filter it out, so that you
Right.
are attentive to every little acoustical bit that's there,
Yeah.
giving your internal system a better chance at using it to build something. Yeah,
Right.
yeah,
Right. I think that that issue of that filtering out, like that beginner who's coming from a whole different sound system, let's say English to Mandarin again, their English system has trained them out of hearing certain sounds that appear in Mandarin because English doesn't use those to mean anything. They don't signify anything, but in Mandarin they do.
yeah,
And so hearing those more
yeah.
makes sense. You
Yep.
need to hear them more because you're not going to be able to distinguish them at first because you're not trained to categorize them, like you were
Right.
saying earlier.
That's right.
So
Yeah. And those categories, those mental categories take a long time to
yeah,
for your brain to build.
yeah,
Okay, let's cut it here. Thanks for
yeah,
listening. This
fun.
has been a fun conversation.
See you next time.
See you next time.